Top 10 people who were convicted for the crimes of serial killers. Welcome back to Odd Occasions. Today, we're exploring a truly tragic and shocking aspect of criminal investigations. We're counting down the top 10 people who were wrongly convicted for the crimes of serial killers. These are stories of innocent individuals whose lives were torn apart, spending years in prison for horrific crimes they didn't commit, while the real killers continued their deadly sprees. Let's dive into these chilling cases of justice gone terribly wrong. When a serial killer strikes, the randomness of their actions often complicates investigations. Police, not realizing that the killer is a stranger to the victim, might zero in on the wrong person. In high-pressure situations, particularly when the community is in a panic, innocent people can be convicted in the rush to close the case. These tragic stories reveal how some serial killers not only murdered countless victims, but also stole years of freedom from individuals wrongly convicted for their crimes. Number 10. Benjamin Miller. In 1967, the bodies of black prostitutes began turning up near the Merritt Parkway in Stamford, Connecticut. By 1971, 5 women had been found, each strangled to death with their own bras. Lead investigator George Mayer focused on one suspect, Benjamin Miller, a local postal worker and known schizophrenic. Miller, who was often seen preaching at sex workers while waving his Bible, was an eccentric figure, but had no physical evidence linking him to the crimes. Mayer, desperate for a conviction, interrogated Miller, who was subsequently sent to a psychiatric hospital. During his stay, Miller, who was delusional, confessed to the murders. He was charged and institutionalized even though there was no solid evidence against him. 4 months later, a break came in the case when Robert Lupinacci, a man known to solicit sex workers, was arrested for attempting to strangle a prostitute near the same parkway. Lupinacci's car had been spotted near the murder scenes, and investigators found hair belonging to black women inside his vehicle. Additionally, a pornographic playing card found at one of the crime scenes was linked to a deck in Lupinacci's car. Despite these damning pieces of evidence, neither Mayer nor the district attorney wavered in their belief that Miller was guilty. Miller, who pleaded not guilty due to insanity, spent 16 years in a psychiatric hospital before an attorney reopened the case. In 1988, after years of legal battles, Miller was granted a new trial and the charges were dismissed. Tragically, after so many years of institutionalization, Miller was unable to adjust to life outside and voluntarily committed himself again. He died in 2010. Lupinacci, the more likely suspect, was never charged for the murders and always denied his involvement, maintaining that his only crime was the assault he was convicted of. He passed away in 2014. As for Mayer, the man responsible for Miller's wrongful conviction, he remained firm in his belief that Miller was the killer until his death later that year. Number 9. William Avery. In February 1998, the body of 39-year-old Marietta Griffin was discovered in a pile of garbage in a garage in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Griffin, who was involved in the sex trade, had been strangled to death. During the investigation, police connected her to a crack house run by William Avery. When Avery learned that the police were looking for him, he voluntarily went in for questioning. In his interview, Avery allegedly mentioned that Griffin had been at the crack house earlier and that he recalled grabbing her, but then he claimed to have blacked out. However, Avery later recanted this statement, saying it was false. With no solid evidence linking him to the murder, Avery was initially arrested on drug charges, not murder. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison in 1998. 6 years into his sentence in 2004, Avery faced a new charge, first-degree reckless homicide, after jailhouse informants claimed he had admitted to killing Griffin. Based on this dubious testimony, Avery was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Meanwhile, the real killer, Walter Ellis, had managed to evade detection through a devious scheme. Ellis had convinced another inmate to submit his DNA in place of his own for the CODIS database, allowing Ellis to go undetected for years. In 2010, Ellis's true DNA was finally entered into the system, and it matched DNA from the murders of 7 women, including Griffin. Avery, who had spent over a decade in prison for a crime he didn't commit, wrote to the district attorney requesting the DNA from the Griffin murder be retested. Sure enough, the test results linked Ellis to Griffin's murder. Avery was released in May 2010 after 12 years of wrongful imprisonment and was awarded over $1 million in a settlement. Walter Ellis, known as the Milwaukee North Side Strangler, was later convicted for killing 7 women over a 21-year period. He died in prison in 2013. Number 8, Jacob Beard. In June 1980, Nancy Santomero, 19, and Vicky Durian, 26, were hitchhiking from Iowa to West Virginia to attend the Rainbow Gathering, a peaceful event hosted by the Rainbow family, which promotes love, understanding, and harmony. Tragically, the two women never made it to the gathering. Their bodies were discovered in a field on June 25th, both shot multiple times at close range. For 2 years, the case remained cold. Locals in the area were not particularly fond of the Rainbow family, even harassing them and firing shots at the group. The community's resistance made the investigation difficult, and many residents refused to cooperate with the police. Despite the dead ends, police received a disturbing call from an anonymous man who claimed they weren't doing their jobs. This call was traced back to Jacob Beard, a local resident who already had a troubling reputation, having killed his girlfriend's cat and left it on her bed. Beard told several conflicting stories regarding the murders, including accusations that other locals were involved. Despite his inconsistent tales, the police were unable to tie him to the murders until a witness, Lee Morrison, came forward 3 years later. Morrison claimed that Gerald Brown, another local resident, had murdered Santomero and Durian, and that Morrison had helped him dump the bodies. However, Morrison later admitted that his entire story had been fabricated under threats from Beard. The case went cold once again until 1992, when a new investigator decided to reopen it. During interviews, multiple townspeople began implicating Beard. Based on this witness testimony, despite the fact that the witnesses often contradicted themselves and recanted their statements, Beard was charged with the double homicide and convicted in 1993. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A year later, notorious white supremacist serial killer Joseph Franklin, who was already on death row, confessed to the Rainbow murders. Franklin, whose other victims were mostly interracial couples and minorities, told investigators, "I committed the Rainbow murders. The Rainbow killings were a little different because I just picked them up hitchhiking." Franklin even provided a map of the location where the bodies had been found, further supporting his confession. Despite this, it took several more years before Beard's conviction was overturned. In 1999, after spending 6 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Beard's case was retried, and he was found not guilty. In 2000, he received a $2 million settlement for his wrongful conviction. Joseph Franklin, who was ultimately convicted of 7 murders and suspected of killing at least 22 people, was executed on November 20th, 2013. His other notorious crimes include the shooting of civil rights activist Vernon Jordan Jr. and paralyzing Hustler publisher Larry Flynt. Number 7, David Allen Jones. In 1992, the bodies of 3 prostitutes were discovered strangled near an elementary school in South Los Angeles. While reviewing records for sex offenders in the area, police zeroed in on David Allen Jones, a janitor with a severe mental disability and the intelligence level of an 8-year-old. Jones had a history of minor sex-related offenses, including being arrested years earlier for being with a prostitute at the school, and more recently, for the attempted rape of another prostitute. During a 2-day interrogation, Jones was questioned without an attorney present. The police used leading questions which led the mentally disabled man to confess to the murders, despite his innocence. In 1995, Jones was convicted of 1 count of second-degree murder, 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter, and 1 count of rape, earning a sentence of 36 years to life in prison. A decade later, the Los Angeles Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation into a series of strangulation murders that had occurred between 1987 and 1998. When DNA evidence was processed through CODIS, it revealed a chilling truth. 10 of the murders, including those attributed to Jones, were committed by Chester Turner, a pizza delivery man already in prison for rape. In light of the new evidence, Jones was exonerated and released in 2004 after spending 11 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. He was awarded $720,000 by the city of Los Angeles and an additional $74,600 from the state as compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. Turner, meanwhile, was ultimately convicted of 15 murders and sentenced to death twice. Number 6, Anthony Capozzi. Between December 1983 and July 1984, a series of brutal rapes occurred in Delaware Park, Buffalo, New York. The victims reported that their assailant grabbed them from behind, threatened them with a gun, and ordered them to stay on the ground after he fled. Despite an extensive search, a year passed without any arrests. Then a former police officer spotted Anthony Capozzi acting strangely at a coffee shop near the crime scenes. Capozzi, diagnosed with schizophrenia, resembled the vague description of the rapist given by the victims. Police brought him in for a lineup, and several of the victims identified him as their attacker. However, there were significant issues with the case. 3 of the victims described the rapist as weighing between 150, 160 pounds and being athletic, but Capozzi weighed over 220 pounds and was far from athletic. Additionally, Capozzi had a prominent 3-inch scar above his left eye, a detail none of the victims mentioned. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Capozzi was charged with 3 sexual assaults. In 1987, based on witness testimony, he was convicted of 2 rapes and sentenced to 35 years in prison. But Capozzi wasn't the actual bike path rapist, and after his imprisonment, the real rapist continued to attack, escalating to murder in 1990 and again in 1992. Capozzi began applying for parole in 1997, but each time he was denied because he refused to admit guilt for crimes he didn't commit. Then in September 2006, another woman was murdered near a bike path in Buffalo, exactly 16 years after a similar killing. Police, realizing the murders and rapes were connected, began to suspect that Capozzi had been wrongly imprisoned. As detectives reopened the case, they found a lead that had been missed years earlier. A victim had written down the license plate number of the attacker's car. When police interviewed the car's owner, they discovered that his nephew, Altemio Sanchez, had been using the car at the time of the rape. Sanchez was arrested, and his DNA was linked to the rapes and murders, confirming that he was the real bike path rapist. Capozzi's lawyers demanded DNA testing of the evidence from his cases. Though initially believed to be lost, the rape kits were eventually found, and testing proved Capozzi's innocence. After spending 22 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit, Capozzi was exonerated and awarded $4.25 million in compensation from New York State. Meanwhile, Sanchez admitted to 3 murders and a dozen rapes and was sentenced to 75 years to life in 2007. Due to the statute of limitations, Sanchez couldn't be charged for the rapes. Number 5, Jerry Frank Townsend. Between 1973 and 1979, several African-American women were found raped and murdered in Broward and Miami-Dade counties, Florida. One victim was 13-year-old Sonia Marion, who was discovered beaten and strangled to death. The police believed they had their man, Jerry Frank Townsend, a carnival worker with an IQ of just 50. Under pressure, Townsend confessed to 23 murders across the country. Townsend was convicted of 1 rape and 6 murders, though he was acquitted of killing Sonia Marion. He received 7 concurrent life sentences. However, the true killer remained at large, leading to the tragic deaths of more women and children in the years that followed. In 1988, the Sun-Sentinel ran an expose pointing to another suspect, Eddie Lee Mosley, a mentally disabled man suspected of at least 40 rapes and a dozen murders, including the crimes Townsend was convicted of. Mosley had dropped out of school by the age of 13, and as an adult, he worked as a junk collector. He was repeatedly arrested for sexual assault, but due to his mental state, he was often found not guilty by reason of insanity. During Mosley's stays in psychiatric hospitals, the string of rapes and murders in Fort Lauderdale ceased, only to start again when he was released. Despite mounting suspicions, Mosley was not definitively linked to the murders until DNA testing began in the 1980s. By 1988, Mosley had been confined to a mental hospital once more, where DNA linked him to at least 8 murders. However, due to his mental incompetence, he was never tried. In 2001, a cold case investigator revisited the murder of Sonia Marion and re-examined DNA evidence from other murders tied to Townsend. It was discovered that Mosley had been responsible for 2 of the murders for which Townsend had been wrongfully convicted. Townsend's confessions in the other 4 murders were then called into question. After spending 22 years in prison for crimes he did not commit, Townsend was exonerated and freed. He later received a $4.2 million settlement from Broward County and the city of Miami. Eddie Lee Mosley, believed to be responsible for 41 rapes and 17 murders, died in 2020 at the age of 73 while confined to a Florida hospital. Number 4, Julie Rea Harper. On October 13, 1997, Julie Rea Harper's life took a horrifying turn. She awoke in her Lawrenceville, Illinois, home to the sound of a scream. Rushing to check on her 10-year-old son, Joel, she found his bed empty. As she frantically searched for him, she was suddenly attacked by a masked man. A violent struggle ensued, smashing 2 glass doors. Rea Harper managed to chase the man outside, where he attacked her again before disappearing into the night. Initially, Rea Harper believed Joel had been kidnapped. But to her utter devastation, police found his body between his bed and the wall. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. Despite her insistence that she was not responsible for her son's death, Rea Harper quickly became the primary suspect. The police found no signs of forced entry. The knife used was from her kitchen, and much of the case against her was built on circumstantial evidence and her behavior following the murder. Her former husband, a police officer, painted a damning picture, claiming she had once said, "If I can't have Joel, you can't either." He even testified that she had considered aborting Joel while she was pregnant. In 2002, Rea Harper went to trial. Her biggest mistake was not testifying in her own defense. After just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to 65 years in prison for her son's murder. Years later, true crime writer Diane Fanning saw Rea Harper's case on 20/20 and noticed eerie similarities between Joel's murder and the crimes of Tommy Lynn Sells, a drifter and serial killer. Fanning, who was writing a book on Sells, knew he had been in the area at the time of Joel's murder. 2 days after Joel's death, Sells had raped and murdered a 13-year-old girl in Springfield, Missouri. Fanning contacted Sells and mentioned Joel's murder in her correspondence. Sells responded with a chilling confession. He admitted to breaking into a home, stabbing a child to death, fighting with a woman, and then fleeing, all 2 days before the Springfield murder. This confession aligned with the night of Joel's murder. In 2004, due to a legal technicality, Rea Harper was granted a new trial. During her second trial in 2006, Sells' confession was presented as evidence, leading to Rea Harper's acquittal after spending years wrongfully imprisoned for her son's death. Tommy Lynn Sells confessed to 50 murders, though not all were verified. Investigators were able to confirm 15 murders and 2 attempted murders. Sells was executed on April 3, 2014, for the 1999 murder of 13-year-old Kayleen Harris, who was killed in her sleep. Number 3, Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez. On February 25, 1983, 10-year-old Janine Nicarico was home alone in her Naperville, Illinois house, sick from school. When her older sister returned later that day, she found the front door kicked in. The television was still on. The family dog was hiding in the basement, but Janine was missing. Tragically, 2 days later, Janine's body was found in a nearby wooded area. She had been raped and beaten to death. The kidnapping in broad daylight sent shockwaves through the quiet Chicago suburb, and with no leads, police were desperate for answers. A $10,000 reward was offered for any information, which led Rolando Cruz, a 20-year-old gang member, and Alejandro Hernandez, a high school dropout, to concoct a plan. In an ill-fated attempt to claim the reward, they started feeding the police false information, even implicating each other in the murder. Their misguided ploy backfired, as the police used their statements to charge both Cruz and Hernandez, along with a third man, Stephen Buckley, with the rape and murder of Janine Nicarico. Despite the lack of any physical evidence, Cruz and Hernandez were convicted in February 1985 and sentenced to death. The jury was deadlocked on Buckley, who was never retried. A breakthrough came in June 1985, when Brian Dugan was arrested for the abduction, rape, and murder of 7-year-old Melissa Ackerman. While in custody, Dugan confessed to a string of violent crimes, including the rape and murder of Donna Schnorr, and crucially, the rape and murder of Janine Nicarico. Dugan's confession, however, was ignored in relation to Janine's case, and no action was taken to free Cruz and Hernandez. In 1989, their convictions were overturned on appeal, and both men were granted new trials. Shockingly, Dugan's confession was still not presented as evidence, and both Cruz and Hernandez were once again convicted in the early 1990s. Cruz sentenced to death, and Hernandez to 80 years in prison. Finally, in 1994, another new trial was ordered for Cruz. This time, DNA evidence from the crime scene was tested, and it did not match Cruz or Hernandez. To add to the case's unraveling, one of the police officers involved in the original trials recanted his testimony. Cruz was found not guilty in November 1995, and Hernandez was released a month later. After spending 12 years in prison, including time on death row, Cruz and Hernandez received settlements from the county and state, both in the seven-figure range. DNA evidence ultimately linked Brian Dugan to Jeanine's murder, the crime he had confessed to back in 1985. In 2009, Dugan was sentenced to death for Jeanine's murder, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison after Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011. Number 2, Huugjilt. In 1996, 18-year-old Huugjilt discovered the body of a woman in a washroom at a textile factory in Huugjilt, Inner Mongolia, China. Acting as a good Samaritan, Huugjilt immediately called the police. However, instead of being treated as a witness, he quickly became the prime suspect. At the time, China was pushing for swift and decisive action against crime. Under intense pressure, the police coerced a confession from Huugjilt after just 2 days of interrogation. Despite his lack of involvement, Huugjilt was convicted and, in a devastating miscarriage of justice, executed by firing squad within just 61 days of the crime. Unbeknownst to authorities, the real killer, Zhao Jihong, remained free, and the consequences were horrific. Over the next 9 years, Zhao raped 13 women and girls and murdered 10 people. He was eventually caught in 2005 and confessed to his crimes, including the murder for which Huugjilt had been wrongly executed. In 2006, Zhao was put on trial and convicted of 9 murders. However, it wasn't until 2014 that Zhao was brought back to court and officially convicted of the 1996 murder for which Huugjilt had been executed. Huugilt's name was finally cleared, exonerating him of the crime, and his parents, who had spent 18 long years fighting to prove his innocence, were awarded 2.05 million yuan in compensation. Zhao Jihong, known as the Smiling Killer, was sentenced to death and executed on July 30th, 2019, finally bringing an end to his reign of terror. Number 1, Kevin Green. On the night of September 30th, 1979, Kevin Green left his 9 months pregnant wife, Diana, at home while he went out for a cheeseburger in Tustin, California. When he returned, Kevin saw an African-American man leaving the apartment building in a van. Upon entering his apartment, Kevin was confronted with a nightmare. Diana had been brutally raped and beaten. She was immediately taken to the hospital, but her injuries were severe, and doctors waited 24 hours before performing an emergency C-section. Tragically, their baby girl did not survive. Diana remained in a coma for a month. When she woke up, she suffered from memory loss, especially concerning the attack. Despite this, after being released from the hospital, she went home with Kevin and began working on recovering her memories. While reading a magazine about pregnancy, Diana suddenly claimed that Kevin had been the one who attacked her. She remembered refusing him sex, which she said had triggered his violent outburst. Based solely on Diana's recovered testimony, Kevin was arrested and charged with the second-degree murder of his unborn daughter and the attempted murder of Diana. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, despite the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime. In 1996, nearly 2 decades later, Santa Ana investigators began working with the newly developed CODIS DNA database. They were investigating a series of brutal rapes and murders committed by an unidentified serial killer known as the Bedroom Basher, who had terrorized Southern California in 1978 and 1979 by breaking into homes and attacking women with blunt objects before raping them. When DNA from the Bedroom Basher cases was tested, it matched a man named Gerald Parker, who was already in prison for another crime. Investigators also discovered that Parker had committed one more attack, the one on Diana Green that had caused the death of her baby. This exonerated Kevin Green. In June 1996, after spending 16 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Kevin Green was released. The judge issued an apology to Kevin, and he was awarded over $600,000 by the state in compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. In a shocking twist, after his release, Diana sued Kevin for the wrongful death of their daughter, claiming that he had attacked her before Parker's arrival. Kevin has consistently maintained his innocence, and the case was settled out of court. Gerald Parker, the real bedroom basher, confessed to his crimes when confronted with overwhelming DNA evidence. He was sentenced to death in 1999. And that concludes our list of 10 innocent people who were convicted for the work of serial killers. These stories are heartbreaking reminders of how flawed our justice system can be and the devastating impact it has on those wrongly accused. If you found this episode insightful, make sure to give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our deep dives into the strange and tragic. Thanks for watching Odd Occasions, and remember, sometimes the truth is more terrifying than fiction. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.